And so we started off with sorrow. Last week we jumped up to joy. And today we take another violent turn to anger. Anger. Anger is perhaps the most volatile of all our emotions. We often get angry. What is it that makes you angry? Have you ever done something in your anger that you later look back and you regret? You don't have to raise your hand if you don't like. Have you ever said something in your anger that looking back you wish, man, I wish I hadn't said that? You feel remorse, you look back and you go, man, that's not me. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have said that. But in my anger, it got the best of me and I did this, I said this, and I wish I hadn't. It's perhaps affected all of us in this way as we deal with anger. And I believe personally that the world has an anger problem. We get angry too quickly. So what is it that makes you angry? Maybe something popped into your head. Maybe the better question for today is, who makes you angry? Or what group makes you angry? Maybe that person popped into your head or that group came to mind. Who makes you angry? We certainly have an anger problem. And today I'm not talking about the world and their anger problem. Rather, I feel we actually have an anger problem within the church. An anger problem in the Christian circles. You see, what we do, we have our anger and we feel this anger for whatever reason. We're going to talk about it today. But what we do, we get this nice cloak. Kind of lay this cloak over top of it. And this cloak is called righteousness. Oh, now we got righteous anger. Have you ever heard of righteous anger? That's what us Christians have, right? We get angry, we do things we shouldn't do, but it's like, hey, it's okay. Hey, look, this is just righteous anger. This is right. It makes us feel good, like a warm blanket, this righteous anger. Oh, I'm just being righteous. My anger is righteous. It's how we tend to justify things. We do things that don't look a lot like Jesus, yet we tend to call it righteous anger. And so we're going to look today at what exactly righteous anger is. We'll conclude our service with that. And we're going to look at a few examples of Jesus himself experiencing anger. You see, oftentimes for us, as we're going to look at the difference between our anger and the anger that we see in Jesus, for us, here we are in this category. We're the Christians, the religious, the righteous, pick your category, the saints. Here we are, and our anger burns against these people, the world, the sinners, the flesh. Pick your word. And here we are over here, and we got anger, and our anger is directed at them, those people, they. Maybe that group that popped into your head. There's different categories we place into this worldly sinner column that helps us direct our anger even better. Maybe it's the other political party. Well, you're red, and so the blue people, I'm angry at them. Or you're blue, and so I'm pissed off at the red people. I talk about politics quite often. And many of us are very angry and upset often with the other side, the other color. Not color of skin necessarily, the color of our political affiliation. The Republicans or the Democrats. We get angry at them and we classify them, and our anger burns against the other side. We classify them as the worldly, the sinners, the flesh, whoever they are. But oftentimes our political lenses help bring clarity to who those other people are. And the cable news channel that we ascribe to watch, they just remind us again and again and again of why we ought to be angry and why we ought to hate and why we ought to be fearful. And they stir this up. It's why I believe that most people, many people in fact that are Christians, are much more discipled by their cable news channel than they are Jesus. And you can tell these are the people that are always grumpy. They're always angry. They always have something to be mad about, and it's always them, those people over there, particularly that other political affiliation. What I love about this church, we're not a big church. We're a pretty new church, but I know most people's stories, and I know that we have people in this room that lean hardcore to one direction to the left, and people that lean hardcore one direction to the right. Now maybe you're like looking around, like who's on the other side? I thought we were all on the same side here. People that both love Jesus. but yet it becomes something that becomes the world and allows us to be angry at them. Maybe the group that you use to classify and direct your anger, maybe that's the LGBT community. This has come up from time to time. Everybody got a little tense just now. I know in my experience that the church has treated this community particularly poorly. Not necessarily globally, worldwide. I just know from my experience. In the churches I've been with, served with, attended, spoken with, and in quite a few of my friends who identify as LGBT, that they feel as though there's no grace, they're not welcome, they're looked down upon. There's a lot of anger that we burn towards them. Now, I'll tell you today as your pastor that I do believe holistically, as God has designed humanity, that a man and a woman, God designed those to go together. And that's for a variety of reasons. But yet I know the complexity of the issue. I know people that are born this way, that struggle in this way, and yet they want to love and follow Jesus, and they do love Jesus. These are many of my own friends. Some of you today have family members, brothers and sisters, cousins, aunts and uncles that fall into this category, and you've seen the anger of the church, the righteous, for them as they represent the world or the sinners or the flesh or whatever you want to call it. It's a way for us to direct our anger. And so it's a complex issue that I do believe we should, as a church, have conversations about. And I love sitting down with people that disagree with me on the subject. But it becomes a group that we direct our anger to, the world. Maybe the group for you over here is just the other religions. The Muslims, they come to mind, obviously the Muslims do. But any other religion, we're the Christians and they're not the Christians, and our anger burns towards them. Why do they do those things? Why do they say those things? Why do they think those things? We get angry with them, and we tend to blame and put a lot of our problems on them. It's called scapegoating, and that's a sermon for another day. But these are the groups that we tend to classify as the world, that us as Christians have anger, perhaps hate towards, and we want to call it, dress it up as righteous anger. You know, Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 5, we went through this a few months ago in our Sermon on the Mount series. Matthew 5 says this, verse 21, "You have heard it said to those of old, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say," Jesus, "I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." We're warned about anger. It's not just don't murder, but don't be angry with your brother. And if you are, it's going to lead unto judgment. But yet, we're going to look at two stories where Jesus is, in fact, angry. So how do we reconcile these two together? What can these teach us, these stories of Jesus experiencing anger versus the kind of anger that we tend to struggle with, or maybe not even struggle, we tend to embrace? We like to be angry. I think it helps us. I made this note as I was preparing earlier this week. We like to have that enemy that we can throw our anger towards. It helps us unify over here on this side. Oh, we're all unified because we can all be angry at them. It's a false sense of unity, but it's what many Christians do. We have our anger as the righteous towards the world, the sinners. So let's see what Jesus does. Matthew chapter 21, near the end of the story. 21. "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers.' And then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things he did, and the children crying out in the temple, 'Hosanna to the Son of David,' they were indignant. They were furious. And they said to him, 'Do you hear what these are saying?' And Jesus said to them, 'Yes, have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise?'" Jesus quotes the Psalms. "And then leaving them, he went out to the city, to Bethany, where he lodged there, more than likely with his friend Lazarus and Mary and Martha. Jesus rides into town, into Jerusalem on a donkey, on Sunday. This was called Palm Sunday. It would end up being the very final week of Jesus' life before he's crucified. Opposite Pontius Pilate, who rides in on the other side of town on a great war horse with a military processional, Jesus comes in on a donkey, not just that, a colt, a foal of a donkey, a baby donkey, a peaceful donkey. And he's about to turn things up a notch that would lead to his death. Perhaps the greatest thing that causes this happens the next morning, Monday morning. Jesus goes into the temple. He goes into the temple and he causes a great scene. He flips tables over. He knocks seats over. He drives the people out of the temple, disrupting the establishment, the temple process that's going on. Those buying and selling pigeons. We'll get to that in a moment. This is a quite popular story. Most of us, perhaps many of us, have heard this story before. It's often called the cleansing of the temple. It's in all four of the Gospels. Not that many stories are in all four, but this one is. Jesus goes into the temple, and here's what I know to be true in my experience, once again. Every time we have like a small group or I'm having lunch with someone, typically it's a guy, and I'm with a guy, and I'm like, what's your favorite Jesus story? You already know where we're going. It's always this one. Dadgummit, I love it when Jesus flips them tables. He's just like 300 style kicking people. This is what they envision in their head. I just love when Jesus flips the tables. Many guys that I've talked to, and if you're a guy, maybe you're nodding, you're like, yeah, probably. It's your favorite Jesus story. And it's because you kind of turn Jesus into your own image rather than maybe you conforming to his. I don't know if you've ever seen Talladega Nights. Again, as your pastor, I'm not recommending it. It's not a pastoral recommendation. They sit around the table to pray, and what do? As they're trying to pray in this comedy, this movie, they're envisioning what Jesus is like, and they make Jesus like them. I just envision Jesus in a tuxedo t-shirt, going to Leonard Skinner concert, right? They make Jesus into their image. And if we're honest, many times we laugh at that, but we like to turn Jesus into our own image as well. And we want to be angry, and we like to flip some tables. So, hey, that's a story I like. I like Jesus flipping them tables, driving those people out of the church. I want us to understand today why Jesus does what he does in this story. What Jesus does, I like to call a prophetic protest. I think it's the best way to understand it. A prophetic protest, a prophetic critique of the temple establishment and what it had become. And he does this bit of this political theater, if you will. Maybe I'm ruining the story for you, but let's ruin it together. He references and does something that had happened 700 years earlier with the prophet Jeremiah. So let's go back 700 years. Jeremiah chapter 7. We're going to read this together, verse 1 through 11. The word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Again, this is 700 years before Jesus is there, born in Bethlehem. Stand in the gate of the Lord's house, that's the temple, and proclaim there this word and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you men of Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord. Jeremiah is standing in the doorway, the gateway of the temple, and he's preaching this message to all who enter. Verse 3, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly execute justice one with another, if you do not oppress the sojourner, the fatherless, or the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own harm, then I will let you dwell in this place, in the land that I've gave of old to your fathers forever. Verse 8. Behold, you trust in these deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come but stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, only to go on doing all of these abominations? Has this house, which has been called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord. This is what Jesus is doing as he flips tables over in the temple. He's referencing what Jeremiah had done 700 years before, and then Jesus comes to fully complete the task in the temple now. God's people with Jeremiah, they were like, oh, we're safe. We got God on our side. They had this phrase, the temple of the Lord. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. This is what they would say. As if to say, we're all good, we're safe, God's on our side, He's not going to let the enemy conquer us, we're not going to be exiled, we're safe. We got the temple, look at this temple. We got the Lord, He's on our side. This is how they felt, how they thought. And Jeremiah says, no. God says, no. These words are to no avail. I don't want to hear your empty words, your empty phrases that you heap up to me. You are not living according to my heart. God demands justice. To care for the weak, the fatherless, the sojourner, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. The list goes on. You are taking advantage of them, you are oppressing them, and then you are coming into my house and pretending all is good. And God says no. These people would be conquered and would be exiled because they would not follow God as He had shown them. He says, you have turned my house, which is supposed to be a house of prayer for all people, that's what Isaiah says, into a den of robbers. What does Jeremiah mean when he says a den of robbers? Maybe your translation says den of thieves. What does a robber go to a den for? Not to steal. They go to the den to hide out. They go to the den to be safe. In fact, this is them saying, you're going out into the world and doing all of these atrocious things and taking advantage of the poor and oppressing those who are the least of these, and then you're coming back to the church as your den to feel safe. They're not stealing from the church. They're coming to the church to feel safe. Oh, we got the temple of the Lord. We got God on our side, but we're living in a way that's contrary to God's heart. We're oppressing those who God demands justice for, that we ought to care for and lift up. So when he says you've turned into a den of robbers, he's saying you're using the church, the very place of God, to actually hide out, to feel safe from the world in which you are oppressing. Jesus comes to fulfill this 700 years later, and certainly in his anger, which we'll talk about, he flips over these tables. He drives the people out. He shuts down the process, let's say, for a couple hours. They got to pick up all the coins and the change, and they got to catch the pigeons wherever they went off to, and then they get things back going. But Jesus does this for a particular reason. Why the pigeons? Why pigeons? You know, when Jesus was 8 days old, his family, him and his parents, went to the temple as was customary, and they provided a sacrifice, and they did so with pigeons. And they did this because they were poor. You see, the rich people, as you come to the temple, you would offer sacrifices, oftentimes of goats or rams or calves or all these things that you had of your possession you would bring with you because you had these things. But the poor, the marginalized, the least of these, they would come and they didn't have anything to bring. And so they would have to offer sacrifices of pigeons or turtle doves. These small things, seemingly insignificant, they would have to give their sacrifices. And so to come to worship God, you have to offer your sacrifice. And so the poor people would come to the temple and they would have to buy or trade to get a pigeon that they might offer it as a sacrifice that then they might worship God. Jesus comes in and sees these people that are money changers and he's furious. This is not because they're selling stuff. Please don't hear this as like I go to the church and they got t-shirts or hats or they've got coffee mugs. It's not about a church selling anything. That's not what this is about at all. They're taking advantage of the poor by charging high rates for the pigeons. So a poor family would come and want to buy a pigeon to offer it as a sacrifice, and they can't even afford a pigeon because the people of the church, the religious people, are taking advantage, once again, of those who are the least of these. Jesus is angry and flips tables over to say, you've turned this temple into a den of robbers. You're robbing and keeping the very people, the least of these, the oppressed, the poor, from entering into my house to worship. That's what makes Jesus so angry. Jesus being angry at not the world, he's angry at the religious who are keeping people at an arm's length from God. Our next story comes from Mark 3. Let's look at another example of Jesus being angry. That was near the end of his ministry, the last week of his life. This is near the beginning. He's still traveling around Galilee, going into synagogues, and he does so on this occasion on the Sabbath. Again, Jesus, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus. These are the Pharisees, the scribes. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And then Jesus said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill?" He's offering this riddle for them to ponder. What is allowed on the Sabbath? But they were all silent. Verse 5, and he looked around at them with anger. There it is. This verse actually has the word anger in it. Jesus looked at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out immediately, held counsel with the Herodians against him about how to destroy him. Jesus goes into the synagogue, as he often would do, especially on the Sabbath. And there's a man there with a withered hand, a disease that he could not cure, heal himself. It was a withered hand, and this man, Jesus sees him. Jesus has compassion on him. Yet the Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers, those that supposedly know the law of God the best, they were already watching Jesus. They had already seen Jesus do some stuff that they didn't like, pushing some of the boundaries that they enjoyed being there. And they were watching Jesus to see what he would do. Certainly Jesus wouldn't heal this man on the Sabbath, because on the Sabbath you are not supposed to work. They, of course, had learned this from God. God on the seventh day creates all things, and then on the seventh day, what does he do? He rests. Now, God did not need rest. God does not get tired. He does never grow weary. But he does this. He rests on the seventh day that he might teach us, give an example for us. It becomes one of the 10 Commandments to keep the Sabbath day holy. And so God's people, through the law and through their word of mouth, had kept this Sabbath day holy, had understood that on the Sabbath day we do not work. Several years ago, I told the story before, we went to Jerusalem, my wife and I, and we were there, and at the hotel, it had many floors in the hotel. Every other day you would get on to press the button to go to the floor you want to go to. On the Sabbath, you could not press the button. You could not cause a spark, as they would say. So the elevator on the Sabbath would just stop at every floor, and you just got off on yours. I say this to say you cannot work on the Sabbath. That's just 10 years ago. And so they're watching Jesus to see if he would heal this man on the Sabbath. And what does Jesus do? He heals him. Jesus would go on after this passage to say that he would say, "I am Lord of the Sabbath." I am Lord of the Sabbath. He said the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. I want us to understand what's going on here. He said the Sabbath was created for mankind, not mankind for the Sabbath. He's making an important point. The institution of the Sabbath, the principle of the Sabbath, was designed to serve and benefit us as humanity. We need the principle, we need the lesson to stop, to rest. We need the Sabbath that we don't make an idol out of productivity. Every other nation, every other kingdom, they could work all 7 days and they get in more grain or fruit and vegetables. Their harvest is greater because they work that extra day. God's people who follow him and his example, on the seventh day they will rest. As if to say, I know you can produce more on your own. We're not going to make an idol out of what we can produce. We're going to rather stop and rest and trust God to provide. It's the same principle for the tithe, by the way. Certainly we could have more money if we didn't give a tenth to the Lord, but he says we're not going to make an idol out of money. I want you to trust me to fill in the gaps where you don't understand. And the Sabbath is just this principle. We need the Sabbath. It was instituted to serve us, to benefit us. We need this principle. Jesus says the Sabbath was for man, not man for the Sabbath. These Pharisees, in their understanding or perhaps misunderstanding of the law, they were serving the Sabbath. They thought that they were created for the Sabbath. So they're following the law as they deemed fit, and they misunderstood the heart of God so badly to not even see that we should heal this man who is broken, who is sick, who needs help. And this is what makes Jesus angry. That these people who had studied the law so well to understand God had so missed God's heart in this matter. You know, when I think about the Sabbath and this principle of it being for us rather than us being for it, I can't help but think about politics. Let's go back to that for a second. Jesus could also say, I am Lord of the politics. Of course, he can say that about anything. Jesus is Lord of all. He would say, perhaps, that politics, your political party, was created to serve us, not us serve them. You see, when we started the political parties, they were designed that they would serve us and our interests. There's different ways to view the world and how things should run, and I get that, I understand that. But the party was created to serve us and our interests, to be a benefit to us as we organize ourselves in these different views or sides. But now we've turned it and misunderstood, just as the Pharisees have done. Rather, now we serve the politics. We serve the political party. We have to jump in the deep end with both feet and think and believe all the same things that our party does. No longer does it serve us, we serve it. And it's caused quite a lot of problems as we misunderstand. It's the same principle of the Sabbath. These Pharisees had so misunderstood God's heart as they followed this rule that they didn't even want to see this man healed. Jesus comes as he fully reveals God to say, no, this is what God's heart is like. This is actually what God cares about. The Sabbath was to institute in you a principle that you would rest and trust God. Not that you would disregard your fellow man because of this rule that you have misunderstood. And it says Jesus was angry. It says he was grieved at their hardness of heart. And then Jesus restored the man. You know, the word there for anger in this passage, angry, is the Greek word orge, O-R-G-E. It's often translated as wrath in the New Testament. Many times you'll see the word wrath and it's this word, but here in this passage it's translated anger. And it has the connotation, obviously, from wrath, but what it really means is to teem or to swell as an emotion. That's actually more literal of what wrath means. It's to teem or to swell up as an emotion. It's not a quick reaction response. Jesus didn't come in not knowing what was going on and just react. This is not what this word means as you look at the meaning from the Greek. This word wrath, now we've talked about wrath before, and I want to close out today on this area. What is wrath? What is the wrath of God? It's in the Bible quite often as we, as humanity, are trying to figure out what this wrath of God is all about. What does it mean? What does it mean for us? You know, the wrath of God is not an emotion of God. This is not one of the characteristics of God. Maybe we think about it in that way. Rather, I want us to understand wrath. God has made a path for us to walk. This is the way we ought to go. This is how I've designed you to walk. This is how I want you to be fully human. We as humans rather have taken a different path, gone the wrong way. God created all things, and I said a few weeks ago, created all things in love. And the grain of the universe itself is made with God's love. We're getting philosophical. But we have gone the opposite direction, going after pride and lust and power and greed, and it's led to all the sin and oppression of the world, going the wrong way. And when we go the wrong way against God, against the grain, what happens when you go against the grain of something? It splinters out. You feel the shards. We feel the shards of the self-inflicted decisions we've made in our sin to go the wrong direction, opposing God's direction that He has for us. We tend to call this the wrath of God. This, again, is not an emotion of God. This is us going against the grain, the way God has created us to live. I believe we are more punished by our sins than for our sins. This is the principle I'm talking about. We go the wrong way that God has not designed us to go, and it causes us to suffer the consequences of doing things the wrong way. This is the wrath of God, and this is what's baked into this word. When Jesus gets angry, they've misunderstood God and they've gone the wrong way, and they're suffering the repercussions by not understanding the law at all. God desired that this man would be healed, and Jesus healed him. This is how we can best understand wrath and what the wrath of God is all about. And so as we close today, I want us to come all the way back around where we started, to this righteous anger. We see Jesus get angry, yet he tells us, don't get angry. Don't be angry with your brother. It'll lead you to judgment. But yet we see Jesus angry. So what is this anger of Jesus, and how can we learn from his examples? Just these two. What is righteous anger? I have two good answers, I believe, for you today. And if you want to write these down, actually I don't think we'll have them on the screen, but if you want to write them down, I encourage you to do so. What is righteous anger? Number one, anger towards the righteous who oppress others. What is righteous anger? Number one, it's anger towards the righteous who oppress others. This is what we see in Jesus. I haven't found a story of Jesus where he's pissed off at the world, at the sinners. He's always angry and upset and irritated at the religious, at the righteous, when they misunderstand God's law and keep people away from God in the process. That's what happens in the temple. That's what happens in the synagogue. Jesus is angry at the righteous, and if we want to have righteous anger, it doesn't mean that we're going to be righteous at the world, at the sinners, at the other political party or the LGBT or the other religions or the woke companies that we get mad at Disney or Nike or all that is not righteous anger, but we like to call it righteous. That is not the anger we see in Jesus, getting mad at the world. That's not what we see Jesus do at all. Jesus in his anger is always mad at the righteous who keep people away from God, who close off and build boundaries to get to God. This is what causes Jesus to be angry. And if we want to have righteous anger, it's not to be mad at the world, it's to be mad at religious people who use God to keep people away. Number two, what is righteous anger? Anger leading unto grief and eventually restoration. Anger leading unto grief and eventually restoration. Jesus, in this moment of anger, it says he was angry at them. He looked around and he was angry. He had wrath. And what's the next word in the verse? He grieved. He was angry at them and he grieved. He was sorrowful of the hardness of their heart. How could they misunderstand this? How could they not understand God's heart? He was grieved. If us in our anger leads us to do things of violence or revenge or retaliation in some way, that's not righteous anger. If your anger leads you to violence, it's not righteous. The anger that we see displayed in Jesus, who reveals God and humanity to us, his anger led him to grieve the brokenness of the world, the brokenness of the systems that keep people down and oppressed. He was grieved that the Pharisees didn't want to see this man healed. So if we want to have righteous anger, it doesn't lead us to... Jesus could have I'm mad at them, and then he just starts punching people, punching the Pharisees. That's not what Jesus does. He's angry with them. It leads him to grieve. And in his grief, it leads him to restore the man who's sick. Restore the man whose his hand is withered. For us, if we want to have righteous anger, our anger should lead us to grieve, not to be violent. And maybe that's physical violence, or maybe that's this keyboard violence, those keyboard warriors. Our anger does not lead us to violence. Our anger leads us to grief. Grieving the systems that are broken, grieving the world that has gone wrong, and how we can then, as Jesus showed us, step in to bring hope and restoration to what is broken, to heal that which is sick. If we're able to view sin as Jesus does, if we're able to view sin as brokenness, it allows us to better step in to say, how can I bring healing? Sin is a sickness. Sin is brokenness. And we as the people of God ought to be the ones first in line to say, how can I help? How can I help bring healing into your life? Righteous anger is towards the righteous, those who would oppress and keep the people away from God. And righteous anger is when it leads us to grieve brokenness, not to anger, not to violence, rather. This is what we learned from Jesus. So for us, as we move about our lives, as we move on from this place and experience those things or those people that bring us anger, may we be reminded, am I angry as a righteous person, as a church person, as a Christian person at the world? Because if I'm doing so, I'm not really looking a lot like Jesus. Or am I angry at the systems that the church has put in place, that the religious have put in place to keep people away? That's what made Jesus angry. And if your violence leads you to do things in your anger that you look back on and regret, acts of violence, whether physical or words that are said, whether you respond that way, if that's where your anger leads, it's not anger of Jesus. It's not the anger that we ought to follow. It's okay to be angry. It says it this way. We'll conclude with the book of James. We've hit up James a couple times in this series. Let's conclude with James. He says this, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of a man does not produce the righteousness of God." In our anger, the anger of man, he says, our version, our way, to get mad at the world and to act violently toward others, that does not produce the righteousness of God. If we want righteous anger, this, the example from Jesus, is how we must live. Slow to anger. Don't wake up every day and find a reason to be angry. Maybe turn off the cable news channel for a minute. Find ways to bring hope and restoration to the world. That's and ultimately where our anger should lead anyway. So as we deal with anger, as you think through anger, think about those two test cases. Is it towards the world or towards the righteous? And does it lead me to violence or does it lead me to grieve? This is anger as we understand in Jesus. Let's pray together.